a video about Max Weber's The Protestant Work Ethic and the Spirit of Capitalism. I first came across this book many years ago now when I was in sixth form. I remember reading the Wikipedia page in the common room, in the sixth form commons room, and have been meaning to read it for many years. I finally got around to it a few weeks ago, and have to say, was very impressed by it. I've actually read it twice in the last 2 weeks. Although it's short, it's actually really an essay. I think Max Weber on a few occasions actually talks about in this essay. It's a very short book, but it is quite dense. There's a lot inside it. So I wanted to read it twice actually, because occasionally he writes a sentence which is actually quite profound, in the sense that he's talking about something complex that requires research into finding out exactly what he's talking about. This book was written in 1905, so quite recent. And what the author is doing, the author is German, Max Weber is a German, and he was a sociologist. But in the book he puts forward a thesis, an argument, which basically states that one of the main reasons why northwestern Europe, in particular Germany, the UK, the United States, are richer, are wealthier, and more prosperous, is intrinsically related to Protestantism. And he goes into why this is the case. So it's an argument that he makes, he puts forward this argument, and he goes into quite a lot of detail into the inner workings of Protestantism, and in particular the various sects of it. So he talks quite largely about Calvinism, and Calvinism is quite a peculiar religion within Protestantism. It's a form of Protestantism, but it's characterized by a number of key beliefs. And the argument that Max Weber puts forward is that two of the key beliefs, which I'll talk about in a moment, were crucial, were essential in forming an ethos, a pattern of behaviour, a way of thinking, which led to the development of capitalism. So within Calvinism, and it's well worth checking out what Calvinism is, but essentially there's a belief in predestination. And what that is it's a belief that some people are predestined to go to heaven. They have been chosen by God. They're what's called a part of the elect group, which God has chosen. And this was a particular belief of Calvinists in the 16th century. Interestingly, the Calvinists and the Presbyterians and other denominations, because what happened during the Reformation is that the Catholic Church fractured into a number of different sects, and all of those different fractures, all of those different sects have been classified as various forms of Protestantism. Protestantism, breaking that word down, just means protest. And Martin Luther, German monk who rebelled against the Catholic Church, wrote his 95 Theses, criticisms of some of the practices of the Catholic Church, particularly the sale of indulgences. Martin Luther criticised the Catholic Church. This was way back in the 15th century, for selling certificates essentially to guarantee that people that buy these certificates, these indulgences, their souls would go to heaven. And Martin Luther criticised this. He said it was exploitation, and it had very little to do with scripture. And so, of course, at this time, this caused massive upheaval in Germany, revolts, a lot of bloodshed, a lot of turmoil. This was the Reformation. And all of the groups that came in the aftermath, the various Protestant groups. So one of the things that characterises Protestantism is essentially they reject dogma and authoritarianism. In essence, they reject the authority of the church as being a mediator between man and God, so that the Protestants believed that man can have a direct relationship with God, and that the church was not the necessary instruments for him to make contact with God through the various sacraments. So there's a rejection of the practices of the Catholic Church and of the papacy in particular. In England, that was more pertinent because Henry VIII, of course, set up the Church of England and made himself the head of the Church of England. But all of these groups, particularly the Calvinist elements, distilled, as it were, into Puritanism. And the Puritans, the English Civil War and the revolution led by Oliver Cromwell was a deeply religious conflict. The Puritans, there's a fundamental difference between the way that the Protestants and the Catholics think, and it goes back to some of the key ideas of Calvinism, in that so once you have the belief in predestination, what then becomes necessary is that what Max Weber says in this book is that a lot of people were worried about whether or not they were a member of the elect, and they didn't know. So the only way they could the only way they could get some kind of verification was through work, was through labour, and that in working and in doing, they would augment the glory of God on earth. So another characteristic of Protestantism is that it's much more a rejection of otherworldliness in the Catholic Church. They believe in otherworldliness and more in supernatural aspects. For example, the classic case is that in the Catholic Church, they used to believe that in the sacrament of the Eucharist, the bread was transformed into the body of Christ, and this is a specific belief. It's more of a Catholic belief that God can intervene in the world directly, whereas the Protestants, they tend not to believe this. They believe that man can have a direct relationship with God, and that through his work in the real world, God, the glory of God, is realised. And so that's one aspect of the belief, that in order to know whether they are good enough to be a member of the elect, it comes through grace, and grace is a consequence of hard work, and they would see the fruits of their labours. Another aspect of Calvinism, which Max Weber talks about, is asceticism. So this is discipline. It's about rejection of luxury and of pleasure. Essentially, it's about delayed gratification. And so the Puritans, if you think back to what happened when Oliver Cromwell became Lord Protectorate, when he essentially became the King of England, he banned alcohol and other forms of indulgence, because the Puritans believe in being frugal and being disciplined, and using energy only in doing the work of God. He also makes the point that the writings of Martin Luther, incidentally, Martin Luther also translated the Bible, which was previously only written in Latin, into German. And so German peasants, the average person in Germany, could access the Bible. And so the word became much more important in Protestantism. And again, that goes back to the idea of not needing the Catholic Church and of the people within it to dispensate what's right, what's wrong. And so again, it's about reading the Bible, and people in the Protestant tradition glorifying God, by obeying the law, by being methodical, by there's an idea that he alludes to in this book called the calling. Martin Luther talks about man's calling, and this is another reason why in the book Max Weber believes that Protestants work harder, is that they believe that in the minds of Protestants, what their work isn't just a job, it's a calling from God, and it's their duty to work as hard as possible, because God has given them that task, God has given them that duty, and so they're compelled. And if they don't work hard, it's a form of disgrace if you use the opposite of grace, and it's a way that they're not going to be a member, they're not going to be a part of the elect group. Some of this might sound quite fanciful. One of the reasons why I had to read it twice was because it's quite difficult to understand the minds of people in the 16th, 17th and 18th centuries. But these people were devoutly religious people. And in understanding the Protestant work ethic, you have to really try to understand things from their perspective. They genuinely believed in heaven and hell and the afterlife. It's not just an abstract thought. Because when I first read it, I was quite sceptical of how can predestination make somebody work harder. But if you genuinely believe in an afterlife, that when you die you will go somewhere, it's not too difficult to imagine how that can motivate someone to be diligent and frugal in the now, in the here and now. And so he makes all of these arguments. They are quite complex, and so the book is interesting in that you'll get a good understanding of the various Protestant sects and the particular ways they think. But it's interesting because he quotes Benjamin Franklin in the book as well, quite early on, and he talks about how Benjamin Franklin's famous quote, "Time is money," how Benjamin Franklin didn't himself believe in predestination, but the idea of working hard and saving, the other aspect of the aesthetic dimension of Protestantism, that is a rejection of pleasure, of wearing fancy clothes. Often you see the Puritans, they wear just plain black clothes because they reject all forms of what you could call showiness, because they believed in, there's an idea within Protestant tradition called the invisible church, and that is people would, in their actions, demonstrate that they are in God's favour, that they are operating under the grace of God. And if they happen to be wealthy and rich, in the Protestant tradition, this is not seen as something bad, it's seen as something good, because this means that it's a blessing from God. If somebody is working hard and they're producing things that are useful to other people, people are going to pay them. And an aspect of Calvinism is that Calvinists, at the very start of the book, Max Weber, he says that he wants in this essay to explore why Protestants do so well in business, and why they're often at the top of companies, and why they are so rich. And he says one of the reasons is that they work incredibly hard, again because they want to see, and they want to get into the elect, and for them to see if they are a part of God's plan, essentially. And also they refuse to spend money in an irrational way that doesn't glory God. So you can see how those two determinants, a willingness to work hard and a willingness to save and to invest, how those two elements combined can lead to investing and of a capitalistic enterprise. So I am quite persuaded by the book. I'm not entirely sure of this element of predestination. I actually think that it is an element within in explaining how it is that Protestants work so hard. But I think he never mentions this in the book, but I regard it as a rejection of dogma and of authoritarianism, and it's more a transition towards I think therefore I am, Descartes' famous idea. That is to say, I'm not just going to accept these ideas and these habits and these ways of thinking. Everything's subject to question, and as an individual, I can use my talents, my God-given talents, to work hard. I think I definitely think that the idea of not drinking alcohol or indulging in idleness, one of the things in the book is that it's a particular aspect of English culture in the 19th century and in the Victorian era, is that there is a loathing really of idleness, and he makes the point in the book that this comes from a belief that people who are begging for money are wasting the talents that God has given them. And so this is part of the reason why in the 19th century you see the development of the poor laws and of the workhouse, where people were told they had to go and work. You can't just receive money from the state, you have to work. Only through work will you be saved. Your salvation will come from working and working hard, and that's what God wants you to do. That's what everyone is called to do, and that is what you must do. That was the way of thinking of people in the 19th century, and incredibly frugal and thrifty. Didn't believe in making things, extravagantly pretty and luxury. You can see this when you go into a Catholic church versus going into a Methodist church, for example, or a Calvinist church, in that the Protestant churches tend to be much more plain, no fancy artwork, because there's a rejection of not only dogma, but of emotionalism generally. This is the point that Max Weber makes in the book. He talks about how in the Puritan way of thinking, emotion is seen as illusory, in that it's a distraction from the calling. It's a distraction from what God intends for the person to do, which is to commit wholeheartedly to their duty, to fulfill their potential and complete the task, complete their labour to the best of their ability. And that essentially is why, in Max Weber's view, in North America, in the UK, in northern Germany, why these parts were why these were the first to industrialise, and why capitalism really had a massive energy, and in the Netherlands as well, because of how these peculiar set of circumstances and ideas and beliefs, how they were transmitted into practice. So it's an interesting book. I probably, it's going to take some time to go through it, and what I had to do was I had to research some of the other ideas in the book, because to Max Weber, who has studied the various Protestant sects in great detail, he knows a lot more about the inner workings and the patterns, but unless you are familiar with that, although it's a short book, it will take a long time to fully understand and appreciate what exactly what the argument is that he's making. So it is interesting. I'm not fully persuaded by all of his arguments, but I think there definitely is something in the transition towards rationalism and being methodical and planning, the idea that an individual should, once receiving a calling, works in a methodical manner with due diligence to carry out the will of God. And I think that is an element that would have been there in the 18th and 19th centuries, because those people in those times, they were devoutly religious by modern standards, modern times. Nowadays most people, or many people in UK and America, they celebrate Christmas, they celebrate Easter, but they don't read the Bible every day. But people in those times, it was an everyday part of their life. The interesting thing is as well is that even today, the United States is a more religious country than certainly Western Europe, and economically does seem to have so much more going on, and when you listen to American entrepreneurs and businessmen, they very much seem to take the view that making money and being successful is very much a positive thing, and it's all about glorying God and demonstrating the talents that they've been given. So I definitely think there's something in it, because you can see the effects of that mentality even today. Whereas in the less Christian countries, you don't see that drive and that energy going towards giving your all to, succeed in a particular business endeavour. So it's an interesting book. I would recommend it, but do be aware that it'll probably take you a week to read it, but there's a lot of research that needs to go on around the edges of it in order to fully understand what he's talking about. So thank you very much for watching. Every week I will be posting videos, so next week look forward to presenting another one for you. Thank you.